You might think all kidnappers are the same, purely opportunistic or driven by malice. But the truth is far more unsettling and nuanced. We're breaking down the surprising psychological profiles behind abduction, revealing the distinct behavioral patterns that differentiate instrumental gain from coercive control, and what that tells us about the criminal mind. Let's start by dismantling a dangerous myth. When most people imagine a kidnapper, they picture a monster, someone fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. Someone born evil, someone whose brain is wired completely wrong. And while that makes for compelling television drama, it's a simplification that prevents us from understanding the real mechanisms at work. The reality is that kidnappers emerge from a complex interplay of psychological vulnerabilities, learned behaviors, cognitive distortions, and situational factors. Understanding this isn't about excusing the behavior, it's about prevention, intervention, and ultimately, keeping people safe. Behavioral psychology teaches us that actions, even criminal ones, serve a function for the individual committing them. This is called functional analysis, and it's crucial to understanding abduction. Every kidnapper, regardless of their specific profile, is trying to meet a psychological need. That need might be financial security, a sense of power, revenge, or even a distorted form of connection. The method they choose, kidnapping, is their solution to that need. But here's where it gets interesting. The psychological profile of someone who kidnaps for ransom looks dramatically different from someone who abducts to exert control over a specific victim. Let's explore the first major category, the instrumental kidnapper. These are individuals who view abduction as a means to an end, usually financial gain. Think of the classic ransom scenario. From a psychological standpoint, these offenders often display traits associated with antisocial personality patterns, but not always in the dramatic way popular culture portrays. They tend to have developed what psychologists call moral disengagement. This is a cognitive process where someone restructures their thinking to make unethical behavior acceptable to themselves. They might tell themselves the victim is insured, that rich people deserve to lose money, or that they're not really hurting anyone if they release the victim afterward. This internal narrative is essential for them to bypass normal empathy responses. Research in behavioral psychology shows that instrumental kidnappers often have histories of escalating criminal behavior. They didn't wake up one day and decide to kidnap someone. Instead, there's usually a progression. Maybe they started with theft, moved to robbery, and eventually saw kidnapping as a logical, if twisted, next step. This progression reflects a pattern of reinforcement. Each successful crime reinforces the behavior, making the next one easier to contemplate and execute. Their risk assessment becomes distorted over time. They overestimate their abilities and underestimate the likelihood of getting caught, a cognitive bias known as optimism bias, which in criminal contexts becomes particularly dangerous. What's particularly revealing about instrumental kidnappers is their emotional detachment during the crime. Functional MRI studies of individuals with antisocial traits show reduced activation in brain regions associated with empathy and emotional processing, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala. While we can't scan every kidnapper's brain, behavioral observations align with this neuroscience. These offenders can compartmentalize. They view the victim as an object, a commodity necessary for the transaction. This objectification is a defense mechanism that protects them from experiencing guilt or emotional distress. It's not that they're incapable of feeling, it's that they've learned to shut down those feelings in specific contexts. But here's a critical distinction. Not all instrumental kidnappers are psychopaths, though some certainly are. Psychopathy, characterized by callousness, lack of empathy, and manipulativeness, represents one extreme. But many instrumental kidnappers are simply individuals who've developed antisocial patterns through a combination of environmental factors, poverty, exposure to violence, lack of opportunity, and poor impulse control. They might feel remorse afterward, even significant remorse, but in the moment, their need for money or resources overrides their moral compass. This is where cognitive distortions play a massive role. They engage in what's called neutralization theory, telling themselves temporary lies to neutralize the moral weight of their actions. Now let's shift to a completely different psychological profile, the expressive or control-oriented kidnapper. This category is where things become deeply unsettling because the motivation isn't external gain, it's internal psychological satisfaction. These individuals kidnap to fulfill needs for power, control, revenge, or a distorted sense of relationship. The victim is never just a means to an end, the victim is the end itself. In cases of parental abduction, we see this control dynamic play out in heartbreaking ways. A parent who kidnaps their own child is often operating from a place of perceived injustice, desperation, and an overwhelming need to maintain connection and control. From their distorted perspective, they're not committing a crime, they're protecting their child or asserting their parental rights. This cognitive reframing is so powerful that they can engage in behavior that terrifies the child while genuinely believing they're acting in the child's best interest. Psychologically, these parents often struggle with abandonment issues, poor emotional regulation, and an inability to separate their needs from the child's needs. The child becomes an extension of themselves rather than an autonomous individual. Then we have perhaps the most disturbing subset, those who kidnap for sexual gratification or sadistic control. The psychological profile here often includes elements of paraphilic disorders, severe personality disturbances, and in many cases, a history of childhood trauma that was never processed or treated. These offenders have developed what psychologists call deviant arousal patterns. Through a combination of fantasy reinforcement, exposure to violent or exploitative content, and often their own victimization experiences, they've created neural pathways that associate control, fear, and suffering with gratification. The role of fantasy in these cases cannot be overstated. Behavioral psychologists have found that violent offenders often spend extensive time in fantasy before acting. These aren't fleeting thoughts, they're elaborate mental scenarios that are rehearsed repeatedly. Each rehearsal strengthens the neural connections and lowers the barrier between thought and action. The fantasy becomes increasingly detailed, increasingly violent, and increasingly normalized in their internal world. By the time they act, they've mentally committed the crime hundreds of times. The real act becomes an inevitable extension of this internal process. What's particularly chilling is how these offenders rationalize their behavior. They employ cognitive distortions so extreme that they converge on delusional. They might convince themselves that the victim enjoys the situation, wants to be there, or even loves them. This is especially common in cases of prolonged captivity. The kidnapper creates an entire alternative narrative where they're not a criminal but a protector, a lover, or someone who understands the victim in ways no one else can. This isn't just lying to others, they're lying to themselves so effectively that they believe it. Let's talk about a concept that bridges both types, the pathway model of offending. Behavioral psychology recognizes that criminal behavior isn't random, it follows pathways shaped by learning, opportunity, and psychological state. For kidnappers, these pathways often begin with early experiences of powerlessness, trauma, or disrupted attachment. A child who grows up feeling helpless, whether due to abuse, neglect, or other adverse experiences, might develop an overwhelming psychological need for control as an adult. The specific form that need takes, whether becoming an instrumental kidnapper who controls through transaction or an expressive kidnapper who controls through domination, depends on individual factors and subsequent life experiences. Attachment theory offers profound insights here. John Bowlby's groundbreaking work showed that early childhood attachments shape how we relate to others throughout life. Individuals with disorganized attachment, often resulting from frightening or unpredictable caregivers, develop profoundly disrupted models of relationships. They simultaneously crave connection and fear it. They don't know how to form healthy bonds. For some, this manifests in kidnapping behavior, particularly in cases where the offender becomes obsessed with a specific victim. They're seeking connection but have only learned coercive methods. They literally don't understand how to form a consensual, mutual relationship. The psychological concept of locus of control is also illuminating. People with an external locus of control believe that outside forces control their lives, that they're powerless victims of circumstance. Paradoxically, this can lead to extreme controlling behaviors as a compensatory mechanism. If the world feels chaotic and uncontrollable, forcibly controlling another person provides a temporary sense of agency and power. Kidnappers with this profile often have histories of feeling victimized, marginalized, or invisible. The act of kidnapping transforms them, in their own minds, from powerless to powerful. Now, here's something most people don't consider: the role of situational factors and opportunity. Not every person with antisocial traits or control needs becomes a kidnapper. Environmental factors matter enormously. Someone might have all the psychological risk factors but never offend because they lack opportunity, because they develop healthy coping mechanisms, or because they're in environments with strong social bonds and support systems. Conversely, someone with moderate risk factors might offend if they encounter the perfect storm of circumstances, financial desperation, access to a vulnerable victim, and belief they can get away with it. This is where crime prevention psychology becomes crucial. Understanding that kidnapping emerges from this complex interaction means we can intervene at multiple points. We can address childhood trauma, teach emotional regulation, create economic opportunities, improve surveillance in high-risk areas, and educate potential victims about safety. Every intervention point potentially prevents a future offense. Let's examine the decision-making process in the moments before a kidnapping. Behavioral economists have shown that humans are terrible at assessing risk, especially when emotional arousal is high. Kidnappers, like all criminals, engage in what's called bounded rationality. They make decisions based on limited information, cognitive biases, and emotional states rather than careful, logical analysis. In that moment, they're not thinking about years in prison, about the trauma they'll cause, or about the real probability of capture. They're thinking about the immediate need, the immediate gratification, or the immediate solution to their problem. Their decision-making is temporally myopic, focused on the present and near future while discounting long-term consequences. This temporal myopia is often amplified by substance abuse, which is common among offenders. Drugs and alcohol don't cause kidnapping, but they lower inhibitions, impair judgment, and make risky behavior more likely. Someone who might hesitate when sober acts impulsively when intoxicated. The substance becomes a disinhibitor that allows dormant antisocial tendencies to emerge. Another critical psychological element is the role of schema and scripts. Throughout our lives, we develop mental frameworks for how the world works and how to behave in various situations. Most of us have pro-social schemas. We've learned that harming others is wrong, that there are legal ways to solve problems, that empathy should guide our actions. Kidnappers have developed deviant schemas. Through media exposure, personal experiences, or subcultural influences, they've learned a script for kidnapping. They know conceptually how it works, what steps to take, how to evade detection. This knowledge makes the act more conceivable and more executable. Interestingly, research shows that offenders often rehearse their crimes, either mentally or through small preliminary acts. A would-be kidnapper might stalk a potential victim, study their routine, test security measures, all before the actual abduction. Each rehearsal reinforces their commitment and normalizes the behavior. It's a gradual process of moral erosion where each step makes the next step easier. The aftermath psychology is equally revealing. How do kidnappers cope with what they've done? Some experience significant psychological distress, especially if the outcome was worse than intended. They might have planned a simple ransom exchange, but the victim was injured or killed, and now they're dealing with guilt and horror at what they've become. Others experience no remorse whatsoever. They might rationalize, blame the victim, or simply move on as if nothing significant occurred. This variation reflects the underlying personality structure. Those with intact empathy systems suffer, those without do not. For kidnappers who maintain prolonged captivity, we see the development of what psychologists call trauma bonds, but from the perpetrator's perspective. They spend extensive time with their victim, they may begin to see them as human despite initial objectification, and they might develop confused feelings. This doesn't make them less dangerous, in fact, it can make them more unpredictable. They oscillate between control and connection, between aggression and affection, creating a chaotic psychological environment that's deeply traumatizing for the victim. We should also address the copycat phenomenon. High-profile kidnapping cases generate extensive media coverage, and this coverage can serve as a template for others. Psychologically vulnerable individuals who are seeking solutions to their problems, whether financial or psychological, see these cases and think, I could do that. Media doesn't cause kidnapping, but it can provide the script and the inspiration. This is particularly concerning with cases that receive sensational, detailed coverage that inadvertently serves as a how-to guide. The intersection of technology and kidnapping psychology is an emerging area. Digital communication has created new opportunities and new risk factors. Online stalking can precede physical abduction. Social media provides extensive information about potential victims, their locations, routines, and vulnerabilities. For control-oriented kidnappers especially, the ability to monitor someone digitally before physical contact amplifies their sense of power and facilitates planning. Conversely, technology also aids in apprehension, creating a psychological deterrent effect, though this deterrent clearly isn't strong enough for those with significant cognitive distortions. So what does all this tell us about the criminal mind? First, that it's not a singular entity. There's no one type of kidnapper, no single profile that fits all cases. Second, that behavior, even extreme antisocial behavior, emerges from comprehensible psychological processes. These aren't mystical acts of evil, they're the result of specific cognitive patterns, emotional dysregulation, learned behaviors, and situational factors that we can identify and potentially intervene upon. Third, that prevention is multifaceted. We need trauma-informed approaches to childhood adversity, we need mental health interventions for at-risk individuals, we need economic policies that reduce desperation, and we need robust law enforcement that increases the perceived certainty of punishment. Understanding kidnapper psychology isn't about sympathy, it's about strategy. When we understand what drives these behaviors, we can predict them, prevent them, and intervene more effectively. We can train law enforcement to negotiate more successfully because they understand the psychological state of the perpetrator. We can identify warning signs in individuals before they offend. We can design environmental changes that reduce opportunity. Every piece of psychological insight is a tool in the larger toolkit of public safety. The human mind is capable of both extraordinary compassion and terrible cruelty. Kidnappers represent the latter, but they're not incomprehensible monsters from outside humanity. They're individuals whose psychological development went catastrophically wrong, who learned maladaptive patterns, who developed distorted cognitions, and who ultimately made choices that devastated lives. By studying them through the lens of behavioral psychology, we don't excuse them, we understand them. And understanding is the first step toward prevention, intervention, and ultimately, a safer society for everyone. Links to recommended self-help books in the description, and if you like this content, drop a comment and subscribe. Your engagement helps us create more deep dives into the psychology behind human behavior, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.